Thank you for being here today. Let's get started. So my name is Cindy Sivageni, and I'm the Diaspora and Inclusion Officer here at SSAP and Hub Cymru Africa. Today's session will look at the importance of committing to take ownership of developing our own deeper understanding of the issues of racism and how they impact our thinking. Our aim with this session is to birth a change in approaches, attitudes, and perspectives towards unsafe spaces and organizational settings. This is a free space, so we welcome questions, comments, reflections. We do strongly discourage any disrespect towards each other. Instead, we aim for healthy dialogues. This shall be the program for today. We shall begin with an introduction, which is a short discussion on race, which will follow on to our anti-racism charter, just a brief introduction on that. Then it will be handed over to Leila who will have the main chunk of this event, and we'll finish off with a Q&A and a very brief poll. So as we enter a session on race, I think it's important to ask ourselves these three rhetorical questions. What is race? This is not an easy question to answer without looking at the concept behind race, as well as race as a social construct. The concept of race was created as a classification of human beings, as a ranking in hierarchical fashion to encourage power. The belief that a classification based on skin color has been used to justify unfair treatment of groups of people for centuries. Race as a social construct is evident in racialization, which refers to the processes by which a group of people are defined by their race. Through this lens, it is thought that race is something that happens to people and does not come from the individual. This encourages assumed characters or general ideas about certain groups of people. For instance, some racial groups are portrayed as more aggressive or dangerous than others. Some racial groups are perceived as more economically stable, while others are perceived as maybe loud or rowdy or persons who lack emotional characteristics. Another question I think we should ask is, what has enabled the spread of racism across time and humanity? According to an anti-racism scholar, Dr. Kendi, racism has persisted due to the simplicity of the science of race. All ages can easily pick up highly disruptive perspectives and attitudes of other individuals who maybe appear or look different, which enables racism to continue to live in our collective blind spot. The third question I think we should be asking today is, why should race still be a point of discussion? Racial progress has two different realities. The first is that it has seen prominent change. So we have seen abolition of slavery, we have seen an end to colonialism. To an extent, we have seen reduction in racial segregation. We have seen equal rights in different nations. One can say these are large changes. However, discrimination still lives on today, with limited improvements surrounding us in areas such as mass consumption of stereotypes, perspectives that are supported over time, police brutality in different nations around the world. Examples that are maybe more relevant to today's session on organizational safe spaces is insensitive racial policies, lack of representation, racial segregation, racial bias in performance evaluations, unequal treatment or opportunities. Today, our session was inspired by our anti-racism charter commitment 2 of the Hub Cymru Africa organization, which states that we will use our positions to challenge racism where we see it, think critically about the racist structures we unknowingly uphold, and dismantle them. For those who do not know about our anti-racism charter, here's a brief background. In creating the anti-racism charter, we recognize the racism presence in development and aid sector, despite intentions such as poverty alleviation, the power dynamics and power structures birthed from colonialization still lives on in interactions with people who we work with in different parts of the world. These power structures present some forms of white saviorism or white superiority in spaces where we should be pushing for racial equality. The anti-racism charter challenges anyone in the global solidarity space, specifically within Wales, to acknowledge how racism manifests and take action to address it. The overall hope of our charter is to minimize the unconscious racial bias and harm found in micro charities and other organizations that are within the Wales Africa space. A few of our objectives: more confident charities in their ability to perform work that aligns with anti-racism, greater racial inclusion in micro charities that focus on Wales Africa work. Thank you so much. I will now hand over to Leila Usmani, who shall be the key speaker for the day.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Asimbi, for that insightful introduction. I'm going to be making some links back as well. So bear with me, everyone, while I do the momentary screen share swapping over and checking that I've got the right screen. So Asimbi, if you can give me a thumbs up that I'm on the right screen. Yeah, stunning. Okay, perfect. I always do little bits of caveats before I start presenting, and I think it's important to bring some of the personal along. Yes, I'm defaulting to a PowerPoint presentation, which is helpful for many, but being anti-racist means about thinking about diversity and difference and sometimes doing things differently. So firstly, I've got some closed captioning there. It kind of just happens. I haven't put it on there. It's happening automatically. And so I think most of it is pretty on point, but it might not read exactly what I say. Secondly, please do make as many notes as you want. I'm all about sharing. I think we need to counter kind of intellectual property and those kind of approaches, because they are very kind of Western ideals. So all of my slides and all of the notes that come with them will be shared with you, so you'll be able to see what I'm saying. On that note, I will be reading from my notes. Now, I try not to be too formulaic, but I am someone who can waffle on. I can talk about this. I get really passionate, and we've got a short amount of time. So I'm going to be trying to stick to the kind of script that I've got. Also, we're all working from home, different spaces. So if you hear a dog in the background, she's just having a good time. I'm in a co-working space at the moment. You might hear people having a little natter, having coffee, but I'm not going to pretend that I am, you know, in this kind of silent space that I can't really afford at the moment. Good, there's me waffling on. Just as an intro as well to where I'm going to go with this presentation, it's a huge piece of work that we've done that I led on. I'm going to go quite quickly through the findings and spend a bit more time on the recommendations. However, when we come, because I want to give time to the Q&A, I don't want to end up being like, oh, we've got 5 minutes. So please do bring your questions. And if you want to bring more questions about the findings, understand more of the context, I'm happy to answer anything. And I'm also happy to be in contact with you all after today. Okay, I'll start with my script. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about these things. You can refer to the report for more details on the methodology. There is a shorter executive summary if you don't want to read my waffling there, as well as the policy framework. And this is specific to Wales. So this work was done in Wales about the Welsh context. Even though employment is not devolved, there's a lot of policy framework that will also apply to your organisations and institutions. It's important to mention as well that when we're doing this kind of research, the findings are generalized. We worked with and I interviewed people from public sector organizations, private sector organizations, the third sector, also from academic institutions. Most of the people were working in slightly larger organizations and having personal experience working in micro organizations of 5 or less people. I still recognize that these experiences can be found in the kind of organizations that you all may be functioning within. Some organisations, however, have managed to counter these manifestations. And if that is you, it would be really great to hear at the end how you work differently. So also feel free to share things about what works well. I'm going to focus on the findings that are most commonly prevalent, regardless of size, but there's most of them, to be honest. And a lot of these can manifest easily in global solidarity organisations, especially as they grow or as they start working in collaboration with others. So applying this to the global solidarity sector is imperative. As in a way, working with racialized people in a project-focused approach or partnership-focused approach can allow more room for modern-day colonialism, white supremacist, institutionally, systemically racist approaches to manifest. What is endemic a lot of the time, there are assimilationist policies and approaches, and Simbi referenced the academic Ibram Kendi, who writes a lot about this, which look at theories of uplift, of trying, in short, to show that racialized people will only be saved, I use inverted commas, once they match the way in which white culture is manifested. The work, well, this piece of work, therefore, I think links with the Hub Cymru Africa's anti-racism charter and this point, and this is why I've come in today, because it is asking you to think critically. It's not just thinking about overt racism or discrimination by omission or directly, but this is about the insidious institutional systemic racism and the broader kind of intersectional discrimination that can perpetuate. The recommendations lie in allies, therefore, using their positions to challenge these. I do more bespoke work on this manifestation, especially around concepts of success, civilization, and development. I did some work with Hub Cymru not too long on that. And I'm here today to talk through this research I led with my Race Alliance Wales hat on, but I welcome further discussion about other things. So we'll get into it then. So this first slide has a quick overview of the findings, and the first section of our findings aimed to describe the experience and cultural environment in offices. Termed as describing the air, regular phrase type that was used throughout our interviews was, you know what I mean, or you get it, you can just feel it. So I utilized the analogy of a spider's web to describe the culture, therefore, elements that are intertwined, that impact one another, but that are impossible to exist without the other, and that going to touch on every part of the organization and are ultimately felt but not seen. If you can imagine that time you've walked into a spider's web, you're like, oh, where is it? In an attempt, therefore, this analogy was used to highlight some of the main findings. And with that, it was clearly denoted that regarding policies and procedures, they're consistently written with a one-size-fits-all outfit. And with this, they're generally constructed from a white perspective, with the archetypal employee being white, male, non-religious. And it was explained by many how policies are not fit for diverse workforces. This was, ironically, you could say, exemplified in equality policies, where all of the contributors commented that they were either impossible to implement for reasons due to the burden of evidence being on the target, or that they led inherently to political correctness. Positive action, which is something unique to the United Kingdom, was rarely utilised, and there was a clear sense of a fear of backlash from societally privileged counterparts when it was applied. Looking at ways of working, these are the kind of minutiae elements. It was clear that the micro processes of working in an office were always done in a particular way, and that there were consistently unwritten rules to adhere to. Contributors noted that for white people, there was this ancestral advantage that bred a cultural capital, allowing them to fit in and navigate the workplace with more ease. Especially compared to people who are either first generation or have migrated to Wales. Finally, when exploring working relationships, the common experience in offices was one of power dynamics and hierarchies, again, quite unspoken, but it was clear that these were not just based on organizational structure, but on race and other marginalized identities, with power in this context being ascertained from being inherently white. White power and comfort were described as always being prioritized, and when topics of observation or observations of race came into play, space for placating fragility was made, or a sheer silence was exuded. This as well led to a sense of gossipy and cliquey relationships, which leaves racialized staff feeling the need to ingratiate themselves. Essentially, there's a clear cultural hegemony in office workplaces, and one that holds an inherent aversion to change and difference. And this was especially prominent in the public sector and academic institutions. When considering the impact, therefore, of this on racialized people, it was clear that we are facing such a detrimental impact to practical opportunities and outcomes, but as well as our psychological safety. Thank you. Just had a coffee delivered to me. So impact on the performance of staff was also regularly reported, with the majority of people noting the need to work harder than their white counterparts to prove themselves worthy. They felt that colleagues would see them as minority hires, and that therefore they faced more scrutiny and micromanagement. And this lack of professional recognition meant that most racialized people are overlooked for progression, leading to many of them leaving organizations to pursue progression in other places. Additionally, another form of leave was sick leave. By virtue of not being able to raise issues, many had experienced needing to take sick leave for work-related stress due to unresolved grievances. And for this reason, many also decided to leave the present employer due to not having energy left to fight injustices or maintain the resilience in the face of regular onslaught of exclusion and institutional racism. A stronger sense of impact was communicated, however, on the contributors' sense of inclusion and belonging, or rather their sense of exclusion and active exclusion in some cases. Having non-work related interactions with their white counterparts, whether that's around the kitchen area or outside of work, it regularly felt that these became a space where they were uncomfortable due to people's biases and microaggressions being more freely communicated as they slipped into their kind of home personal selves. This developed a sense of anxiety around small talk for many people, for fear of having to laugh off an untoward comment. And essentially, many said they ended up feeling alienated and just saw work as a place to go, come and go from, without being able to develop kind of interpersonal relationships from it, leading to racialized people feeling more lonely and isolated. And an ultimate fallout of this was then the consistently described need to code switch as a way to try and fit in. I do this still. I was talking very differently to a Simbi when we started. Now I kind of talk more professionally. The contributors spent time describing the need to learn and adhere to these unwritten office rules, and this hyper awareness around how they express themselves, feeling like they need to kind of perform whiteness at worst, or at best perform the model minority role. And last but definitely not least, it was reported the considered impact on racialized people's sense of psychological safety. All interview contributors and nearly all survey respondents conveyed a clear message that they do not feel psychologically safe in office-based environments. Okay, I'm going to let you absorb. I'm going to skip the more detailed slides, but they will come to you, as I mentioned. And I'm going to just pop onto the recommendations because I think these are really important. So with this, it's an action piece research. So what did come out was considerations about how to improve the experience for racialized people and other marginalized people, as I mentioned, in office-based work environments. Contributors brought many ideas and experiences to the fore, and they felt that could strongly impact theirs and others' experiences. We our approach at Race Alliance Wales, and my approach, is to recognise the possibility in humanity to bring around cultural change through listening, learning, acting, kind of demonstrating, and also embedding and cultivating these changes. We know it's possible to transform culture and therefore the experience, in this case, of racialized people in white-collar work environments in Wales, for the betterment not only for us, but for everyone around us. But these approaches that I'm going to go through need to be a whole organizational approach with sufficient resource and capacity at their core. Just like whole school approaches, piecemeal picks won't work. And that's why I used the spider web analogy. It's a combination of the entire picture that's going to bring around a sense of safety. So I'm going to go through these recommendations, provide a bit of context. I might read a little bit from the slides, but I'll try not to do too much of that. And then we'll have as much time as possible for questions, discussion, and open chat. So be ready for that. And you can show me your lovely faces as well when we get there. So yeah, I'm going to start with the first step, which we put under the banner of learn. So in this area, it was really clear, and contributors made a very clear, communicated very clearly, that leadership is extremely important. But this approach of leadership must centralize listening to racialized, marginalized people. And in these listening exercises, the kind of sense of hierarchies and organizational hierarchies must be removed, and a starting point of belief provided. The role of managers was also noted as central, with the need to prioritize kind of bespoke check-ins with racialized staff, which could be done within positive action, actively reinforcing feelings of safe environments and reminding staff of their worth, together with prioritizing engagement with people on an interpersonal level. Staff training, again, was listed as something to invest in, included in the induction process, as well as ongoing learning and unlearning for white staff, dealing with a range of topics, including but not limited to cultural, systemic and institutional racism, systems of oppression, anti-oppressive practice, anti-racism, power, privilege, fragility and allyship, as well as defining unconscious bias and microaggressions, together with the macro communication held within. White allies were also noted as being an element of a positive working environment and colleagues who actively leverage their privilege. And of course, importantly, staff need to understand what culture is, and we can have a discussion there because we can talk about all of this, but what does that really mean? And especially what organizational culture is, moving away from culture equals nation state or culture equals a certain race. And this is really important to understand, that there is such thing as organizational culture, to be able to understand, therefore, the context for change and for these experiences. We then looked at ACT. So this is kind of more actions, things that can be embedded within an organization. One of them was around recognizing a union, and again, this can be difficult for smaller organizations. It's not impossible, but having potentially staff working networks, be they internal, and if there's not enough people to maintain an internal one, allowing staff to have access to external ones available within their working time, which provides a space for racialized people to speak freely about their experiences and to recognize that they're not the only ones, so that they can move past this feeling of gaslighting themselves, that they might be going crazy, something I didn't touch on in the findings, but that did come up. Following this, the importance of demonstrating care is really highlighted many times through our interviews, including by providing mental health support options should people wish to access them. And it was asked that through this long kind of process of change, that accountability and transparency is provided. Racialized people we know that change doesn't come overnight. We're not expecting change overnight, and we're not asking for that. So what we want and what people would communicate is to say, be honest, tell us what is happening, what are the small things that you are doing, and how we can support those actions in the collective and be patient for the change if we know that the effort is at least being put in. And the final kind of set of recommendations here were put under the transform subtitle. And this was really about that kind of ongoing, deeper transformation to culture. Embedding elements in formalized policies, therefore, was really noteworthy. However, it was communicated that when policies are changed and that there are developments in policy, these changes must be led by racialized staff or consultants. And I think it's important to think about what it means for someone to lead rather than someone to do. Positive action was regularly noted. I mentioned that at the beginning as being a massively missed opportunity. I do work with Welsh Government, and they're even trying to understand how they can utilize positive action. And people felt that this was more important than putting efforts into, for example, equality impact assessments as a central process to policy and program design, incorporating bespoke reviews and ensuring that they're dynamic in nature, therefore. And lastly, a focus on deep transformation was communicated. So constructive behavior change was noted as central to this, not just explaining how to do things differently, but with a real understanding of why, moving from being not racist to actively anti-racist. Here, exploring different ways of working and approaching tasks, making room for difference, and in a way democratizing the workplace was something that was communicated by our contributors, and allowing space for creativity and initiative. It's central to the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan, is do things differently. So this would be key to go hand in hand as well with centering relationship-focused work and collaborative team working. Good, I'm going to stop share. I've actually got a good amount of time, so I can see some things have come up in the chat. Great. Assembly, we were going to see with time if we were going to put people into pairs to just have a 5-minute chat to reflect before coming back with questions. Is that possible, or do we just open the floor?
I think we should open the floor, seeing that the number is quite high today. We can just open the floor, have people have open discussions instead of the whole, yeah. So does anyone have any questions for Leila? Oh, awesome. Okay, Dr. Ibrahim, please go ahead.
Hi, hello everybody.
Hello, Dr.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Regarding the action plan, which it could be delivered by the human resource department in any organization, there is something missing, the time limitation for any action plan to be put in place to eradicate oppression, racism in the workplace. You have any idea what is the action plan in your the last 2 slides, art and transformation?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really important and common question that comes up. And the response is that time is needed. Sense of urgency is also a very kind of Western concept, that we need to get things done and get things done quickly. And it's usually when we do things too quickly that we make mistakes, or that we don't factor in inclusion and the kind of manifestations that I described are developed. With my other work, I've done kind of consultancy work with organizations, and I remember kind of a face of when I said, you know, this might take 10 years to implement these changes, and it was like, what, we're not going to get there next year? And it's recognizing that that time does happen. We're talking around really deep rooted change, and when that's why right at the beginning, the first slide I was saying before, showing the recommendations, resource and capacity is needed for these changes to be implemented. Resource and capacity include time. So there's not really an easy answer to say, oh, you can do this and do it quickly, and then you're going to have these changes by next year or by a year afterwards. Even the Welsh government has said, 10 years for their action plan, and I think that's ambitious. So I know that's not really an answer that you might have wanted to hear. I think with capacity and resource, therefore, that's where it comes in differently, depending on the size of your organization. Many of you may not even have HR functions. So it's kind of like, how can you do that work collectively? How can you share the load? And the organization I was talking about, they've been thinking, okay, so how can we all factor some of our time into trying to drive forward these actions? The last thing I'll say to that is why the point on letting people know what you're doing in the interim is really important, because we don't expect things to happen tomorrow. We're not going to unrealistically expect this change next year. So it's about being able to communicate, show, share, make changes, evaluate, monitor as you go forward, and really be transparent in what is being done. Does that help at all?
It's fine. I would say I love to see a column in the right hand side beside the last column, where there is a 3 to 5, 6 months, 6 months to 1 year, 1 year to 1.5 years, just a sort of a target. Thank you very much. Thank you, Assembly.
Thank you. And I think that's something that each organization has to do independently. There's absolutely no way that there could be a generalized approach for any organization, because it's about capacity. So one organization might take 1 year to implement one of these things. One organization might take 3 months. So that's what I invite you all to do when you're looking at these kind of changes, is think within your capacity, what might you be able to do or not? I can see a question has popped up in the chat. I need to quickly read it. So if anyone else, you can have your thinking caps on, and if you want to put your hand up, but I'm going to go to that question in the chat. Give me 2 seconds to have a look. I can read it out loud if there's anyone who can't see the chat, actually. It says, hi, I'm a Welsh language speaker. Did this report look at the experience of Welsh language? Leila spoke on ancestral capital, navigating the workplace with more ease. And I found that Welsh, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic Welsh language speaking people, sorry, I'm just trying to read I found that Welsh, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic Welsh language speaking people, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic Welsh language speakers occupy a really interesting space between the Welsh Language Act and the Race Relations Act. Thanks, Yasmin, for that question. I mean, the question is, did this report look at the experiences of Welsh language? No, it didn't. So if you want to have more of a chat in this space about that, I think it's a really important point. So yeah, come in if you want.
If you don't mind me asking, why is it that you didn't look at the Welsh language? Because I've done some
because of our own capacity and resource. So similarly, talking to others, it just wasn't something that we had the literally, and when I say capacity resource, I mean time, person, power to undertake. It's as we know, a plague of the third sector in a way that we can't do everything because of the funding, the hours that we're paid to do the work in, and the time frame that the funders want us to deliver in.
Thank you. Only 2% of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people over the age of 18 speak Welsh day to day, but 2/3 of Welsh language speaking Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people are below the age of 18. Do you know of any Black, Asian, and minority ethnic-led organisations that look at intersectionality, looking at ethnicity and language when it comes to lived experience? Because I wonder, for example, with the recent Sage Todd stuff, I don't think there would be an equality impact assessment that would say that what happened with Sage Todd's, that the reputational damage, having worked in the third sector. So I'm really interested in that I feel that a lot of BAME spaces became normatively English language speaking. Like I've worked in BAME spaces where I've heard that BAME people don't speak Welsh, and then I've been in Welsh language spaces where people have seen I don't speak Welsh. I think that I'm really interested in the experiences of BAME people speaking Welsh in the workplace, because I think that this is a form of ancestral capital. and that it's unprecedented and a bit unusual.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree with everything you said. I don't know of any kind of broad scope organizations. Last year I did maybe even longer ago. During my time at Race Alliance Wales, either last year or the year before, I did do some, not work, but I had some meetings with the Welsh Language Commissioner talking about this topic. It was before the Senedd elections, because I also spoke to Cymdeithas and Yes Cymru, and they had kind of branches or sections of their organizations that were, you know, for racialized Welsh speakers, to try and kind of push that agenda forward. But otherwise, no, I'm probably about as aware of it in terms of what is available as you are, and recognize exactly what you say as much as you do.
Thank you. Cymdeithas yr Iaith use a term that means coloured people instead of people of colour. So I'm really interested in how race manifests in this space, because I see it's, you know, I'm not sure if you're a Welsh language speaker, but
No.
I wonder how many Welsh language speaking people are employed by these organisations, as opposed to putting this in what they would call the coloured people bit in Welsh.
I think it's a really important thing, and maybe something that Hub Cymru can take forward, given this anti-racism charter, especially within the context of Wales and thinking about Welsh language in that.
Yeah, definitely, Yasmin. Do keep in contact. We can carry on this conversation. Thank you.
Got some other questions in the chat. So is cultural competency important in organizational interactions?
I meant settings, sorry, rather
settings rather. I think it is 100%. Cultural competency, also known as cultural intelligence or intercultural sensitivity, is something that is extremely important, was kind of listed in that kind of area of learning and unlearning that I think, and I and many people understand, needs to be done. Because when you're learning about culture, in the report I reference a kind of age-old iceberg. So people who are new to concepts of culture, there's lots of different frameworks to understand culture. One of those is through using understanding the concept of your lens, your cultural lens, and how you see things. In my other work, I do a lot of kind of interactive activities about how to kind of recognize the lens that we in which we see. And that's the work that I did with Be Diverse for Hub Cymru as well, looking at concepts of success, concepts of civilization, and it can even boil down to simple things like concepts of politeness, you know, how to have conversations. Someone might see, when I spend time in Brazil, you interrupt each other. That's how you converse. And yet here, it's very, very rude to interrupt someone. So just having an understanding that there's not one right way, but there are different ways, and this applies to a lot of areas of life and people, is really important. We need to move away from the binary of right and wrong, and that's where cultural competency or intercultural sensitivity comes in. Cool. I kind of think between us, Asimbu, we're both having any questions.
I think there was a question in by Julian right after.
Oh yeah, and someone said, is the report fully downloadable somewhere? Oh, thank you so much, Yasmin. Yasmin's put the report in there. Could you tell us more about positive action and how it can be implemented? I can tell you more about positive action, definitely. How it can be implemented, again, is very, very specific to the person, the people, the context that you're in. So that's a bit more difficult to communicate. Positive action is an element, and it's very important to recognize that positive action is not positive discrimination, which is legal in the United States of America. Where we engage with topics of race or equality, a lot of the information we can get is from the United States there, and it can be very US focused. So it's really important when you're reading things to note if you're going to kind of implement stuff, if it is being done in a Usonian context or a UK context. Positive action in simple terms, and I say simple because when it comes to the specific implementation of positive action, I will always encourage people to ensure that they speak to someone who has either a legal framework of understanding or a union framework of understanding, and just make sure that it is going to fall in line with the Act, and with the statutory codes that the EHRC has presented, which I've done a lot of reading on. If we understand reasonable adjustments, which means that for a disabled person, you would put in you would implement adjustments or changes or provide an individual with things that will enable them to be able to do XYZ in the same way as non-disabled, able-bodied people can. Reasonable positive action, is similar to that, but for other protected characteristics, for example. So it is about enabling and overcoming barriers to access. It's about putting something in place that will help those people overcome those barriers. Now, so I'm not waffling on too much and give some time to other questions, but I'm happy for people to ask a clarification. One of the most common approaches or applications of positive action is through recruitment. People say, oh, look, we are all white, so you clearly don't have any racialized people in your workforce. You can then provide racialized people with automatic interview if they reach the benchmark at the application stage. You could do a open session, open day, online, in person, for just racialized people that are interested in the job, because we know that they might not have that cultural capital or may not have access to the networks that allow for nepotism and cronyism that is, rife within a lot of employment sectors. So you're specifically providing things that are going to help overcome the barriers that they face systemically, institutionally. But internally, that can also be done. So within this report, one example is, if we know that racialized people or marginalized people are more likely to experience a sense of not being psychologically safe, then as an element of positive action for people who are of those protected characteristics, and I talk broadly in this sense and also intersectionally, so it's not just about race, you allow them to have time off during their work time, during their paid work time, to access a network, to access a mentor. Now, someone who doesn't fall into those characteristics doesn't have that time off. That is positive action, because they experience certain barriers in work, they experience certain oppressions, certain difficulties. So just saying, oh, if you want that, you can do it, but you've got to do it on top of your job. So you're adding something to them rather than creating space within their working time. What you might find is that most people in the workplace do have some kind of protected characteristic, because we're actually the majority. So yeah, does that help, Julian? I know it's a very quick answer to a very big question. Funny. Okay, where are we with questions?
Can I quickly just ask a question, Leila? So what skill sets or trainings would you recommend for leaders, away from maybe the staff in general, but for leaders of organizations or small charities, to address racial bias? How would we go about that for the actual people on top, so that it can trickle down into, the staff and overall?
I think with that, it's all the same stuff. What is going to be central to that is allyship, which kind of involves all the other stuff anyway, as a follow on or as part of the training, learning and understanding that they have. But being able to really understand what it means to be an ally, and being able to understand all of the elements of that, which include leveraging your privilege, educating yourself, understanding your positionality within the workplace context, as well as within the societal context, because we have different positionality, power, sustained by hierarchical systems. And then with that, it's going to be around, I suppose, more broad leadership. And when you're taking into approach leadership, again, I said, what does it mean to lead? It doesn't mean you're the only one doing it. It means that you're sharing that, you're taking people along with you, you're supporting others to be able to do the same, you're guiding, you're providing guidance. So there's different elements that constitute leadership. It's not dictatorship, and it's not just kind of putting everything on one person and saying you've got to fix it all.
Thank you. We have one question in the comment section.
Yeah. Okay, so yes, Robin has replied to Yasmin. Fantastic. Okay, from Claire. Hi, Claire. Many of the groups we work with are very small, led by 2 or 3 volunteers. It can be hard to challenge racism as they don't always have mechanisms for accountability, and people don't want to challenge the person directly. Do you have any recommendations from your work for bigger orgs that micro ones could implement to improve this? So the question is, small micro organizations, 2 or 3 volunteers, don't have mechanisms for accountability and not wanting to challenge people directly. I think I'm going to start with the second part. The approach of challenging someone for presenting what may be constituted as racism, whether it's unconscious, whether it's institutional and upholding those systems, whether it's applying processes that don't include racialized people, whether it's overt, covert, or insidious, is always really difficult. And actually, I think that links back to the SIMBY's role. That is a clear role that a leader needs to take on, because they need to demonstrate that challenging is important. In terms of the recommendations that I do it starts with the learning, and with that, we need to, and what I always promote and what was spoken about in this report was calling out zero tolerance. Cancel culture doesn't work. People said, yeah, it's great, okay, someone gets fired for racism, but then they just go and be racist somewhere else, and that organization has washed their hands of that individual. I really do think, and when I was speaking to someone about that specific example, I said, so what do you think should be done differently? That was a big part of this report, and they said, well, it's a bit like when you speed, you go on a speed awareness course, you don't just have your car taken away from you. So is there a way of learning, and I promote a lot of kind of restorative justice, transformative justice. Again, sorry, Dr. Ibrahim, these things take a lot longer, a lot more time than punitive approaches. But it's about calling people in. And I think as a leader, if you set that example, if you encourage the 2 or 3 volunteers, even if one of those volunteers is the leader, to do this learning, to understand allyship, what that means is we're on a consistent learning journey. I wouldn't be doing the job that I do if I just believed that people were born racist and they can never change. That's not the case. People are not born racist. So if we can be socialized into it, we do have the capacity to learn out of it. Obviously, work that I've done before with Hub Cymru looks at fragility, the kind of blocks to that learning that can come up. So it's really about creating those space for those conversations. And I think creating space for those conversations before an incident happens, or someone says something wrong, or someone does something, and then it can feel a bit more personal. But there's also creates that basis for, this is what we're working to, and this is how we're going to learn from each other, and this is how we're going to speak to and bring people into conversations when we need to have them. Hopefully that answers a bit of your question. I wasn't really sure about the mechanisms for accountability, because there are so many, whether that's social media, and you're therefore allowing the public to hold you to account via those means, whether it's internally and you have generalized catch-ups and you embed those processes. But accountability is very easy to apply to 2 or 3 people. It's just about thinking what would work in your context. You might have a working group that says, right, we're going to once a month or once every 2 weeks, talk about anything that we found was a bit of an ouch moment, or a bit, that wasn't great, or someone raised this thing and I don't know what to do. So yeah, those kind of different creative ways, and I can talk more about different ways and work with people differently on those. Good. Dr. Ibrahim, you got your hand up again, so yeah, I'll come back.
I think, thank you very much, Asembi. I think Asembi she addressed a very important issue, which is the leadership style. And I think it's all about how we deliver our task. So this is a task now, how we deliver it. I think the leadership style play an important role in this, whether it is dictatorship, democratic, authoritarian, autocratic. So at the end of the day, we need to deliver the task. So fighting racism is a task, we need to deliver it. So we need to put, if you agree with me, the right leader in the right place with the right system, a right style of leadership. Can you have a thought about this one, please, or tell us about this a little?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if autocratic, there's, lots of debates on whether autocratic or dictatorship style leadership works. I think within this framework, it doesn't. And it is actually actively contradictory to anti-racist approaches to have that kind of leadership in place. Having more, whether we want to call it democratic, I mean, there's debates on democracy with democratic leadership, or flat organizations that aren't just anarchists, but are kind of doing things and thinking about leadership in different ways. You're absolutely right, it is key. It's especially important with culture change, and we know this because there's organizations that as soon as a leader changes, the organization seems to kind of fall apart and people suddenly start leaving and don't know what's going on. So there, I think that's the main thing that I can say without using the time to kind of repeat what I was saying in response to Isimbi's question, is that yes, it is key, but within this report, what's important is part of that leadership. And as a leader, you still need to listen to people. You still need to believe people. You still need to get input from people. You're leading a group. You're not dictating to a group. You're not telling, because as soon as and what came out in this report is as soon as you tell people, this is the rule, you can't do that. Well, we think about teenagers, you tell them you can't drink, and then what do? They go and start drinking, but they do it behind closed doors. This is obviously a generalized example and a very British Western example as well. But people don't understand the why. People just don't do it. And what came out in this report is then it leads to political correctness. Oh, I just can't say that here. You can't do this in work. And then as soon as people in these environments do go out after work, and do generally in the UK in white collar environments go out for a drink, that kind of political correctness starts shedding. And that's where we find the example that I spoke about before of racialized or other minoritized people being like, I don't want to go to these spaces because I don't feel safe. That's where I'm going to have to just kind of pretend that comment didn't happen when I was at the pub, or etc. I'm going to stop myself.
Liz has a question for us in the comments, and Molly, and then I think we'll round up because we're in our last 5 minutes. Thank you, everyone.
Perfect. Okay, Liz, I work for a predominantly white organization that's really committed to addressing this and becoming more of an inclusive and diverse place to work. Currently, only 2 out of 40 plus of our staff are not white, and they have expressed exhaustion, frustration at always being approached to contribute to the work going on to improve our policies and processes in this regard, which I totally understand, but we also want to ensure that racialized people are involved in co-creating these as per the suggested action in the report. Absolutely. Do you have any tips for making sure people don't feel tokenized or overly relied on in this manner while still being involved and feeling valued? Yeah, thanks, Liz. That is really common. It's a really common question that's come up when I have presented this report. And again, I'm going to repeat a bit. It comes down to leadership, and that's why we talk about allowing people to lead but not do the work. So you could have the meeting with these people and say, right, what do we need to do? And now we're going to be the administrators that go off and do the stuff. They're the ones kind of spearheading it. And additionally to that, if you're expecting them to do this stuff, you get them to do that in their own time, because a lot of the time what happens is someone's got a job I've been there. And then someone says, can you do all this stuff because you're a person of color? Well, I've still got to achieve my objectives in my job. You're not reducing my objectives, but suddenly you're adding all this extra work onto my desk. And additionally to that, are you recognizing that I'm going to have to relive my trauma a lot of the time? So are you providing them with extra space to deal with that, essentially? And I think that's where you can start looking at not tokenizing people. You're not just going up to them and saying, we want to involve you. We don't want it to just come from a white perspective. So can you have a look? And then as soon as they've had a look, well, you're like, cheers, bye. But that deadline that they needed to get to has been sidelined. Or now they're feeling really distressed and they think, oh, I can't leave work now because I've got a job to do. So say, okay, are you happy to do this? That's number one. If they're not, well, then you can get consultants in. There's plenty of us out there who are happy to do the same work and you pay us for it. And if they are happy to do the work, then you offer them additional support around that, whether that's counseling, whether that's an extra day off, whether you say, okay, so we're going to reduce, you know, we'd expect you to do less of this if you're going to be contributing to that. Because the other thing is with this kind of work, when you're working on stuff that is related to your own identities and experience, it doesn't stop at the point that you send that email. You're probably still going to be thinking about it. You're probably still going to be talking about it with other people. That all should come into the work time. Yeah, hopefully that answers a bit of the question. You could be more creative as well, or think differently about how are you going to support them. But yeah, 2 out of 40, there should be more on offer for their time if they're willing to do that. Does that help? And I know we've got Molly and 2 minutes left. So Molly.
Just really quickly, mine's probably more of a comment. I'm from Bowser, an organisation that provides support to Black minority ethnic people suffering abuse and violence. Me and my colleagues here are from the Human Resources Department, so it's been really interesting to hear the findings. But also just to say from our perspective, because we have majority staff who are Black minority ethnic, that we're looking at this from a slightly different perspective and we work slightly differently. You know, we have to balance the fact that we have people from many different beliefs, cultures and traditions, you know, when it comes to our policies, when it comes to what we do on a day-to-day basis. So it's just from us, we're kind of seeing it from that angle, and hopefully the information that we gain from here will, you know, help us. Not to say that we're perfect, because we do face a lot of challenges in that we're balancing, you know, the beliefs and cultures of people from so many different traditions. Yeah. We've faced challenges, you know, as part of your presentation, you talk about unions. You know, we've faced challenges with unions in the way they've dealt with us, in that the majority of the people within those unions are not from Black minority ethnic cultures, and, you know, their lack of understanding of how we work when it comes to working with them. So yeah, just to say we're really interested, but, you know, from us, it's a slightly different perspective. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Molly. I'll just respond to that very quickly, if that's okay, Simbi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Key. It's really important. And I would invite you to read more on the report, or we can have follow-up conversations. I'm absolutely happy to do that with anyone here on any of the more detailed things. But in the same way that I said one size doesn't fit all, also one size doesn't fit all Black, Asian and minority ethnic, which is a hugely diverse group of people with hugely diverse and different experiences. So there's never going to be one size fits all. And I really appreciate you commenting on that approach, Molly. And unions are still institutions. They absolutely have these problems. And union culture, I tried to speak to unions as part of this research and couldn't find anyone to speak to me, but union culture is a very, very strong culture as well. I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leila, for your time today. And thank you everyone for coming.